Thank you for attending today's webinar. First of all, what I'd like to do is to introduce the team that will be presenting to you today. Myself, I'm Martin Lydon. I'm Director of Services for Finance, Planning and Housing. And my colleague Mary Greer, Senior Planner, she'll be doing a presentation on the process that's involved in relation to the Draft County Development Plan 2021 to 2027. P.O. Burns, the Senior Exec Planner, will be presenting in relation to some of the documents and some of the key policies that are within the overall plan itself. We're also joined by Niall Byrne from Deloitte, who will be making a presentation into a new approach to preparing our core strategy around the housing needs demand assessment. And lastly, but by no means least, we've got David Lestrange from CAS, who'll be dealing with our environmental issues and any questions that you have in relation to that. What I would ask in these strange times that we're operating in is that you do use the questions and answers icon at the top of your toolbar there in Microsoft Teams to ask us questions as we go along. We may not be answering the questions straight away, but what I can assure you is that this is being recorded and any questions will be answered after this webinar and then presented on our dedicated Draft Roscommon County Development Plan website, which can be found at www.rosdevplan.ie. You can also make submissions through this channel, and my colleague P.O. Burns at the very end of the presentation will show you how you can do that. It's unfortunate that we can't meet with people face to face due to current government guidelines, but this is, we hope, an opportunity, a different way of consulting with people, and by no means any indifferent as we aim to answer any questions that you do have. As I said, this will be recorded, this webinar, and will be made available on the website that I had mentioned. Without further ado now, what I will do, I'll pass you on to Mary Greer, who's the Senior Planner, who will take you through the County Development Plan process. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, so welcome to everybody who has joined this afternoon, and we're glad to have you on the other end of this virtual presentation. So this first segment is going to just cover the development plan process, the various stages involved and the timelines involved. So the slide that you can see here sets out the three very distinct stages. So stage one, the pre-draft. Stage two, the draft development plan stage, which is where we're currently at, and stage three, any potential amendments to the draft plan. Now, the preparatory work on a plan is undertaken by the executive of the council in conjunction with consultants that are employed on specialist items, such as the preparation of the environmental reports and the housing needs demand assessment and associated housing strategy. The actual making of the plan is a reserved function. That means that it is the elected members that are responsible for the making of the plan or making any amendments to it. And the statutory process involves members making those formal decisions at key stages during the process. So stage one, as set out there, was ongoing throughout much of 2020. It commenced in Q2 with the public consultation on the issues paper commencing on the 27th of March. Unfortunately, this happened to coincide with the introduction of the very significant COVID-19 restrictions nationwide. And because of that, there was legislative provision to extend the timelines for the public consultation. So those timelines were extended by 8 weeks in total. So after the conclusion of that period, the Chief Executive's report was then prepared on the consultations. This summarised the issues raised and it made recommendations to members as regards how to go forward in implementing those suggestions. Members then formally met, this occurred at a meeting in November. They considered the Chief Executive's report and then they directed the officials to proceed to prepare the draft plan. That process was then ongoing until into Q1 of 2021, and that brings us towards stage 2 of the process. Members formally met in April and they determined that the proposed draft plan, which had been put forward to them for consideration, be put out to public consultation. Public consultation commenced on the 21st of April, and that is the phase that we're now in. It runs until the 2nd of July. So we would encourage everybody to get involved at this stage in the process. And as Martin Lydon mentioned earlier, P.O. Burns will be giving a demonstration on how submissions can be made online during the course of this consultation. So just looking at the elements comprised of stage 2, as I say, we're in the process of the public consultation. At the conclusion of that, a Chief Executive's report will be prepared on all of the submissions received, and it will make recommendations as to how they are adopted into the plan if appropriate. Members will be provided with that Chief Executive's report for a considerable period of time, and they will then formally consider the contents of that at a meeting that will be arranged. The meeting will, the report will be issued to members towards the end of Q2 of 2021, and members will then formally meet to discuss that and decide on the next steps in Q4. Now, what occurs at Q4 when that meeting happens is that members can take one of two options. Either A, they can accept the draft plan as it has been prepared and they can deem it to be met. In a situation where that would arise, the plan would actually become effective 6 weeks later. Or they can alternatively decide to make amendments to the plan, and realistically this is the route that most county development plans would tend to go. They can make amendments to the plan and that will then trigger a further stage in the process, stage 3. So now just taking a quick look at the next steps involved, particularly in this immediate term in stage 2. All of the timelines are governed by the provisions of Section 12 of the Planning and Development Act as amended. And as I've already said, the public consultation on the draft is ongoing until the 2nd of July. The reports, then the Chief Executive's report will be prepared and issued to members towards at the end of Q2 2021. Members formally agree that in Q4. Now, in the event that the material alteration process occurs, that triggers stage 3 of the overall process. If members determine that they are making amendments to the plan, the executive then, after that decision is made, have 3 weeks to prepare that in order to put the document out to public display. The public consultation at this stage is limited to the amendments that have been made and would run for a period of not less than 4 weeks. Again, at the end of that process, a report will be prepared on behalf of the Chief Executive and recommendations will be made to members. Members will then finally meet to consider the outcome of that, and at that point would proceed to adopt the plan. So the adopted plan would come into effect 6 weeks later. At the very latest, that would occur in Q2 2022. There is a provision for ministerial direction in the event that any set of circumstances arise which warrant that, and some of the next slides will deal with that in a little bit more detail. Just to make everybody aware that in addition to the plan being prepared in the context of the hierarchy of national and regional plans, including the National Planning Framework at national level and the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy for the Northern and Western region at regional level, there is also an obligation that the plan is prepared in accordance with ministerial guidelines. They are issued under Section 28 of the plan and they cover a broad range of issues. There is an obligation, a legislative requirement, that the plan includes a statement to demonstrate how the planning authority has implemented the policies and objectives contained in the guidelines. So you may wish to have a look at that in Appendix 1 of Volume 1 of the draft County Development Plan. So just in terms of the ministerial direction that I've made reference to, this is a provision under Section 31 of the Planning and Development Act. and the Minister can issue a direction requiring the Planning Authority to take specified measures in the event of any of the circumstances outlined there arise. So the circumstances are if the Planning Authority fails to implement recommendations made by either the Minister or by the Office of the Planning Regulator, if the Planning Authority fails to take into account a submission or observation made by the Minister or the Office of the Planning Regulator, if the plan fails to set out an overall strategy for the proper planning and sustainable development of the area, if it's not consistent with the National Planning Framework, the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy, or the Section 28 Ministerial Guidelines, or if the plan is not in compliance with the overall requirements of the Planning and Development Act. Care and attention has been taken in the course of preparing the draft plan to ensure that it accords with all necessary elements, and we would hope not to get to the stage of ministerial direction, but just letting everybody know that that is the situation the provision is made for in the Act. So the main thing is that we are now in the draft stage of consultation, and we would very much encourage everybody to continue to get involved as we proceed through that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for that informative presentation. As I'm sure everyone's aware, it's a very technical process. It's quite a long process, but it really is important that the public during this current stage of the process do make submissions and do contribute to sort of developing and putting a framework in place for the next 6 years for the county. I'd now like to pass to Pierre Burns, the Senior Exec Planner, who's involved in producing the development plan along with Mary, who's now going to take you through some of the documents and some key policies that are being put forward here. Over to you now, Pierre. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining. My name is Pierre Burns. I'm acting Senior Executive Planner in Forward Planning, and I'm just going to outline some of go through some of the documents in the draft plan as well as some of the content of the draft itself. So the draft plan has been prepared, as I said, in accordance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial Strategies. So the draft plan consists of 2 volumes and a number of associated documents, as well as a number of environmental reports. Volume 1 consists of the written statement, and this sets out the local level strategic direction for the development of County Roscommon. The written statement sets out the core strategy and details a series of mandatory and discretionary objectives across a wide range of policy areas. Volume 2 contains settlement plans for the towns of Ballahadreen, Castlerea, Elphin and Strokestown, as well as 28 village plans for smaller settlements. It also includes area plans for the Hudson Bay Barrymore area in the south and for the Lough Key area in the north of the county. In relation to the other towns, Monksland and Belnamulla will form part of a joint urban area plan for Athlone, which will be prepared jointly with Westmeath County Council. Separate local area plans will be prepared for Roscommon Town and Boyle. And Courtober will form part of the joint local area plan for Carrick and Shannon, and this will be prepared in conjunction with Leitrim County Council. So back to the documents. The housing strategy assesses the need for housing in the county for the plan period. And this is central to the development of the core strategy as well as the settlement and housing policies set out in the draft. This will be further explored by Niall Byrne from Deloitte later in the webinar. The primary aim of the renewable energy strategy is to ensure that County Roscommon continues to address climate change. This can be done by facilitating appropriate renewable energy developments, as well as supporting energy efficiency in all sectors of the economy. The retail strategy identifies key issues facing the county in respect of retail activity. The landscape character assessment has been reviewed and updated, and actions and recommendations have been incorporated into the plan across a broad range of policy objectives. The LCA also includes scenic routes and protected views in the county. The record of protected structures lists all protected structures in the county. There are almost 600 such structures on the record. The environmental reports assess the impact of the draft plan on the environment, and David Lestrange from CAS will discuss these in more detail later. So, some of the headline topics in the draft. In terms of housing, The draft plan proposes almost 2,400 additional houses in the county up to 2027. These houses will be provided in our towns, villages and the rural areas of the county. How these are allocated into the different areas is outlined in the core strategy. And here is the core strategy table itself. And this outlines how and where housing units are to be distributed in the county. It also shows the amount of residential lands which are required for zoning. Almost 60 hectares of land will need to be zoned for residential purposes to provide these new homes. You will note on the right that there are over 550 houses to be provided on brownfield or infill sites within our towns. This will contribute to compact growth, town regeneration, as well as maximising existing infrastructure. The main aim of each of the settlement plans is to set out a framework for the development of these towns, so that growth may take place in a coordinated, sustainable and orderly manner, while at the same time being sensitive to the environment. A mixed-use zoning approach has been taken with these plans, which departs from the traditional form of zoning, which identified particular parcels of land for particular uses. This new approach will not only increase flexibility, but also the potential of development within these towns. All plans include policy objectives to support the return to town centre living, as well as addressing the issues associated with town centre vacancy and regeneration. 28 village plans have also been prepared, and each of the village plans have been developed to support these rural villages as locations that have capacity to facilitate economic, social and residential development, which is appropriate to their scale. And this development will help sustain and develop existing communities. The villages have the potential to strengthen their population base, and they represent an attractive alternative to one-off housing, especially for those seeking to live and integrate into a rural community while remaining close to local services and amenities. The draft plan also promotes the concept of smart villages, and smart villages can enhance their existing strengths and assets through creative thinking and by embracing innovation to create desirable places for people to live and work. The draft plan recognises the importance to the county of rural life and the rural economy, and it supports the continued growth and development of rural areas. Our rural housing policy is shown here, and this facilitates housing in rural areas subject to certain criteria. This approach to rural areas will facilitate growth of both the rural economy and rural communities. Housing need will need to be shown in certain areas that are classified as under urban influence. These areas are shown in blue on the map. This means that a social or economic link to that particular area will be required. In all parts of the county, siting and design are important factors, and the County Roscommon Rural Design Guidelines should be referred to. The draft also encourages the notion of rural clusters, and this is a new initiative, and it is hoped it will reduce the impact of urban development in rural areas and be an alternative to family members to construct dwellings in a traditional form of settlement. The integration of land use and transportation can help reduce the need to travel. It can facilitate sustainable urban development by shaping the pattern of development and the location and scale of centres of growth. Now, while the provision of public transport is outside the remit of the local authority, the draft does support and encourage public transport providers and rural transport initiatives to enhance the provision of public transportation services, which link the villages and main towns within Roscommon. Walking and cycling are promoted as healthy, efficient and environmentally friendly modes of transport. The plan aims to develop a network of direct, convenient and safe cycle routes and footpaths in the county. Now, these are to be provided not only in rural areas, but also in the urban areas and in the vicinity of schools. A green infrastructure strategy will be prepared and will include provisions for improved accessibility across the county, while ensuring adequate protection to the existing environment. Climate change is a central theme throughout the draft plan, and Chapter 8 of the draft plan outlines strategic aims and policy objectives aimed at tackling climate change at the local level. It shows where modified actions and behaviours can contribute towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Appendix 5 of Volume 1 demonstrates how climate action, adaptation and mitigation policy objectives have been integrated into each chapter of this plan. Roscommon County Council have also developed a 5-year climate change adaptation strategy, which covers the 2019 to 2024. This strategy outlines the most immediate climate-related risks relevant to Roscommon. As mentioned earlier, a renewable energy strategy for the county has been prepared as part of the draft. And this sets out the framework for the delivery of sustainable and renewable energies throughout the county. The Council is committed to implementing the aims set out in this strategy to ensure that Roscommon delivers upon its commitment to tackle climate change through facilitating appropriate renewable energy development proposals in the county. Biodiversity will be protected in the county and recognised as having the potential to enhance a development rather than posing an obstacle to it. The National Biodiversity Action Plan, the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, as well as the County Roscommon Heritage Plan and Biodiversity Plan are all supported. It's important to note that biodiversity is also present in urban areas, and the provision of urban habitats is strongly supported. The Green Infrastructure Strategy previously mentioned will provide a network that can be used for a wide range of outdoor recreation, as well as acting as a wildlife and biodiversity corridor. Rural development and the management of the county's natural resources are critical to the future of the county. The settlement strategy for County Roscommon facilitates those engaged in agriculture and other rural-based occupations to live in their own local rural areas. Greater emphasis on the creation of sustainable communities can be reinforced through sustainable rural housing. And the focus on creating these sustainable communities includes not only environmental, but also social and economic aspects of development. In order to secure sustainable rural development, it's important that traditional rural-based agricultural activity and agricultural diversification are supported. Census 2016 figures recorded a total of 2,311 persons identifying their occupation being in the category of agriculture, fisheries and forestry. But this figure doesn't really capture the full extent of the sector, as it doesn't count those with multiple occupations, including part-time workers in rural-based activities. The draft plan also seeks to ensure the continuity of agriculture in the county for reasons that are not solely economic, and it recognises the important cultural significance that agriculture and farming itself holds. There is scope for agricultural business to diversify into a broad range of areas. The draft plan supports the diversification of farm businesses into areas that do not impact the landscape or the environmental protection policy objectives of the plan. At county level, economic development is addressed in both the County Development Plan and the Local Economic and Community Plan, or the LECP. The County Development Plan is primarily focused on spatial planning, while the LECP sets out priorities and actions on economic and community development. Both plans must be consistent with each other and are interlinked in setting the overall strategic vision for the economic growth of the county. Each of the main settlement centres have a strong individual enterprise focus, with our town teams bringing together people from community, business and statutory sectors to promote various opportunities. The settlement plans contained in Volume 2 for the 4 identified towns set out further detail on the enterprise focus for each settlement. The villages in County Roscommon also play a vital role in sustaining the county's wider hinterland. They provide sustainable rural employment, including local service provision, indigenous industry and micro enterprises. There's also an opportunity for these villages to develop as smart villages with the potential offered by improved rural connectivity. And the Just Transition Fund is a key pillar of the government's Just Transition Plan for the Midlands area. And the concept of just transition is an economy-wide process that produces plans, policies and investments that lead to sustainable jobs, communities and economies. In terms of tourism, the draft plan supports and promotes tourism as an integral part of County Roscommon's economic profile. It supports the implementation of the Roscommon Tourism Strategy in collaboration with Fáilte Ireland, Waterways Ireland, tourism businesses, communities and a host of other supporting agencies. There are over 20 walking and cycling routes throughout the county, and these have been highlighted in the publication entitled Roscommon Walks and Cycleways booklet. It is the council policy to continue to expand and create an integrated network of greenways across the county to maximise pedestrian and cycle access to same. The provision of social, community and cultural facilities is an essential component in increasing social inclusion and contributing to quality of life for all. Roscommon County Council provide a wide range of services in the county, and the draft county development plan sets out the policy framework for the provision of these services within the county. So that is a summary of the content of the draft development plan. This is a draft plan for the future development of our county. Public consultation is open, and if you have any thoughts, we would welcome you to make a submission on the draft plan. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Pia. Thanks for that presentation. I think, look, just to be very clear with the public, this is very much a land use plan and not a placemaking plan, but it does play its part in providing support for other strategies and policies and plans that are in place, as highlighted in Pia's presentation, such as the LECP, the Local Economic Community Plan, which plays a great part in looking at our communities and how we can improve our communities. What is sort of clear throughout the theme of the plan that's being presented to the citizens of the county is that climate adaptation now is key to everything that we do. And you know, the members not so long ago, they did sort of make it clear they thought there was an environmental crisis going on in the country, not let alone the county. And the aim is for the county to be a low carbon, climate resilient county, which is environmentally sustainable. And this is what the policies are looking to do that are enclosed within the plan. PO also identified there the various sort of core strategy numbers that are there, and it's very clear from central government that we need to stay within those core strategy figures, and the funding that does come forward will all be to do with the green economy as we look to support our towns and villages, and the numbers that we're looking to put into the various towns and villages throughout the county. Following on from the core strategy, I'm now going to pass you on to Noel Burns from Deloitte, the consultants that were employed by Roscommon County Council, who undertook the housing needs and demand analysis. And Noel's going to take you through that piece of work and how it impacted on the core strategy. Over to you now, Noel. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I'll just share my screen. Just start now on the take you through the housing strategy and HNDA, guys. As might have been mentioned earlier, it's a requirement under Part 5 of the Act that a housing strategy is prepared. It's a critical component of the CDP and assists in translating those national and regional housing priorities and policies to the local level. And the MPF has introduced this new requirement for a HNDA, or Housing Need Demand Assessment, in order to correlate and accurately align future housing requirements. So it's a new requirement that all local authorities are facing. As it talked about in the plan, or in the housing strategy, the MPF sets out an approach or methodology, and the purpose of the HNDA tool, which is to give a robust evidence to support decisions about new housing supply, and also inform policies about social and affordable housing provision, and other specialist housing provision that might be required. In terms of further on the methodology, as you might be aware, it's a heavily data-driven and evidence-led document, and requires a lot of input from demographic and household data. It also requires inputs on housing affordability, house price data, and the people's ability to access private home ownership as well. I'll just quickly run through the structure, particularly section 4, which looks at the HNDA in detail and runs through the model and calculations. So just in terms of some of the evidence required and data inputs, you know, the model requires inputs from, you know, the current context in terms of population. It also looks at age dependencies and different information like that. It also looks at the current housing stock in terms of occupancy levels and also demographics and what might be required in the future, including, you know, the size of household required. In terms of the other data inputs, it requires an analysis of planning permission data to review trends. So what we know from Roscommon is you know, a high degree of one-off housing, 63% granted during this period was for one-off housing. And then you just see a graph illustrating the makeup compared to private flats and apartments or multi-development housing. So again, you'll see on average 68% of the annual total granted during this period was for one-off housing. We've also in the strategy looked at the social housing stock with assistance from Roscommon County Council. So as you can see, the number of vacant units as of 2020 was 55 and the stock total 1468. Just to run you through then quickly the model and how it arrives at its projections. So this is, I guess, the crucial model within the document. It was provided, this approach under Section 28 guidelines, how you might calculate the demand for housing during the plan period. It builds upon, you know, NPF scenarios on population projections and arrives at a figure of 2353 for the 6-year plan period. And the data to input into this model comes from the CSO, the Department of Housing, the Census, and the ESRI. And population projections, again, prescribed in the National Planning Framework. So Roscommon's projections for 2026 was 70,500 to 71,500. So that again, that's from the NPF roadmap, which we use to build out upon the housing strategy in HNDA. So we use the census data to project population forward for the plan period, and we analyze previous census data to get to this approach. So you can see the population grew by 9% from 2006 to 2011, and slowdown in the next intercensal period, and obviously that corresponds with, you know, economic contraction. So we project the population out to the end of the plan period, as you can see there, and a line on growth, and we've estimated a higher number of units in the early part of the plan period, corresponding with that post-COVID recovery phase, I guess. So again, we look here at average household size, and you can see a slight decline in 2016. And we arrive then at the housing demand, the average annual housing demand figure for Roscommon of 392 units per annum. Again, the model and the housing strategy in HNDA require us to look at house price bands and projected house price bands. That allows us to calculate affordability of housing during the plan period. So you can see you see that a majority of the house price transactions in 2020 were in those 0 to sort of 150, 200k mark. We also analyze historic house price trends in County Roscommon. We look at various sources such as the CSO, the Residential Property Price Register, etc. So you can see from 2020, 69% of the transactions were in that sub 150 price range. So we use all of this data to help us look at mortgage capacity and affordability. What's required here is us to review the CBI rules around housing affordability, which indicates, you know, a 90% LTV limit and a minimal deposit, and also the amount you can borrow, 3.5 times gross income. So again, we also look at the ability to access private rental in the model. We analyze historic rental prices, and we also project rental prices based on economic data and growth trends for the plan period. So the ability to access private rental. So this table indicates the number of households that do not qualify for a mortgage and also cannot afford private rental. So this is based on the affordability criteria. So that's your housing costs below 35% of a household's disposable income. So it takes into account rental prices, disposable incomes, and demand for a particular unit type. And we've also undertaken a calculation to determine the number of households that can afford private rental during the plan period despite not qualifying for a mortgage. So in summary, we get the anticipated social and affordable housing need for County Roscommon. So the number of households during the plan period that do not qualify for a mortgage is 245. What the model tells us is that if those households cannot qualify for a mortgage, they also cannot afford private rental, because those two affordability thresholds are closely linked. Then we get to the identified social and affordable housing requirement for the plan period, and that is 35 to 41 units annually during the plan period. I'll quickly go through some just bits of other research and analysis that go into the housing strategy. We undertook projections of the demand for one-off housing based on previous trends. In relation to trends on planning for one-off, you can see those figures there and the percentages. As a proportion of the overall housing mix, it did decline and then increased again. You can see there in 2020, the one-off housing and multi-development housing is actually closely in the same bracket. So that was an interesting trend in 2020. We also undertook regression analysis to project the demand for single housing during the plan period. The way we did this was analysing historic trends, also population trends, and then the link between employment and the demand for single housing. And you can see those projections there, circa in the 114 to 118 bracket. In terms of social housing need, the housing strategy also analyses that. In terms of the need, at the current figure, it's 318. That's excluding transfers. We also have data there on the current tenure. In terms of the housing strategy, also looks at the statistics on traveller accommodation, building upon the traveller accommodation programme that's in place. In terms of the Rebuilding Ireland targets, the housing strategy also analyses that, and as you can see, County Roscommon was ahead of its various targets. In terms of conclusions then, just to wrap up, so we arrived at a housing demand figure for the 6-year development plan of 2353. That's an annual average household demand of 392 units. As I mentioned, we're predicting a higher amount of units required in that post-COVID recovery phase. And also the model and housing strategy identifies the anticipated social and affordable housing need, and that ranges from 35 to 41 units annually during the plan period. So that's the conclusions, and that's the end of that presentation on the housing strategy.
Thank you, Niall, for that presentation. It's a very technical subject, obviously, to try and explain, so I can understand if some of our participants are struggling with that, but I'm afraid that's the sort of nature of the evidence-based approach that has to be taken in calculating figures for the county. I suppose for a few things there, I hope that the audience have picked up. The housing needs demand assessment is being promoted as the evidence-based approach to be taken in relation to county development plans, but also in tandem with that, it works in correlation with the sort of housing targets that are being set now for county councils in relation to social housing. So there is a direct link between those two. Before we move on to David, can I just remind participants there is an opportunity to be asking questions using the questions and answers toolbar tool at the top of your page, so I would encourage you to do that. just in case anyone is not keen on public, is worried that their question is publicly going to be shown now. It's not. It's private. It's only you that can see the question being asked, and we will, when we do publish the questions, we'll be publishing them as all anonymous, so they won't be assigned to people. So I do encourage you to ask some questions. Before we move on now to David, who's going to go through our environmental reports, can I just say the National Planning Framework and the sort of National Development Plan as well, they're two documents that are closely linked together as well, and will be part of any sort of process as we go into the future around the sort of projects and plans that will come into play within the county. So if you do get a chance to have a look at those documents, I suggest you do so. I'll now pass you on to David Lestrange from CAT, who's now going to take us through the environmental reports. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Martin. Okay, so when Pio and Mary were preparing the draft plan, I was working alongside them, and I was preparing 3 types of environmental assessments. Those assessments were strategic environmental assessment, or SEA, appropriate assessment, or AA, and strategic flood risk assessment, or SFRA. And I'm going to give an overview of these assessments over the next few slides. So strategic environmental assessment, or SEA, identifies the likely significant environmental effects of implementing the plan. And these are effects on environmental components such as biodiversity and flora and fauna, population, human health, soil, water, air and climatic factors, material assets, landscape and cultural heritage. And by doing this, SEA enables the integration of environmental considerations into the plan. SEA is required by the European SEA Directive, and the SEA shows how environmental considerations were integrated into the plan and how alternatives were considered. SEA is informed by appropriate assessment, AA, and strategic flood risk assessment, SFRA. And the findings of the SEA so far are included in an SEA environmental report that accompanies the draft plan. So why undertake SEA? Well, SEA provides a guide to the best areas for development in the county, and it enables the council to direct development towards robust, well-serviced and well-connected areas, the best areas. It also enables the council to direct inappropriate development away from areas that are most sensitive, least well-connected and least well-serviced. Compatible sustainable development in the county's environmentally sensitive areas is also provided for by the plan, subject to various requirements relating to environmental protection and management being met. SEA gives greater certainty to the public and to developers. Plans are more likely to be adopted without delays or challenges, and the plans will comply with environmental obligations. Planning applications are more likely to be granted permission, and environmental mitigation is more likely to cost less. SEA enables environmental protection and sustainable development, and it protects the reputation of the county. So here follows a selection of maps prepared by the SEA and submitted to the council's team who prepared the plan. And this allowed the planning team to prepare a plan that takes account of and contributes towards the protection of the environment. This is a map of European sites designated within and surrounding the county. European sites are special areas of conservation and special protection areas. These sites are designated for the protection of habitats and species important on a European or national level, as well as endangered species of birds. This map shows inner and outer source protection areas. And these areas protect drinking water sources so that the county's residents, employees and visitors can drink water safely without becoming ill. This map shows the Water Framework Directive's status of waters. And the Water Framework Directive is a European directive that requires good status or higher in the county's water bodies. And some water bodies in the county are not meeting this objective. And a status that is bad or poor or moderate can affect ecology and human health. So the County Development Plan aims to further contribute towards the protection of water resources in the county. This map shows groundwater vulnerability across the county, and groundwater vulnerability maps the ease to which pollutants of various kinds can enter groundwater and find pathways to humans and ecology. Another sensitivity that was taken into account was flood risk, and this map shows predictive and historic flood risk indicators across the county. This map shows archaeological designations. Other sensitivities taken into account included those relating to the landscape and those related to wastewater treatment. So this final map shows overall environmental sensitivity in the county, and it has been made by weighting and overlaying a combination of the previous maps shown as well as other sensitivities. And the mapping is prepared using a traffic light style colour coding. Red and orange areas indicate those areas that are most sensitive to development and would require higher levels of mitigation, while the green and yellow areas indicate areas that are more robust from an environmental perspective. And the overlay mapping shows that environmental sensitivities are not evenly distributed throughout the county, and most of the county is identified as having low to moderate levels of sensitivity. The most sensitive areas in the county include the county's lakes, bogs, rivers, mountains, and other designated areas for cultural heritage or landscape. So this slide summarises the key findings of the SCA process. Under the heading of water, potential adverse effects on quality, flow and morphology have been mitigated by policies and objectives in the draft plan for water protection and wastewater treatment infrastructure. The plan facilitates the development of lands that are served or can be more easily served by water services, and the plan will permit development where there is sufficient capacity for appropriate collection, treatment and disposal of wastewater. The plan minimises impacts on ecology by facilitating the development of lands that have relatively lower levels of ecological sensitivities. And the plan contributes towards the protection of biodiversity and flora and fauna by contributing towards the protection of natural capital, including the environmental vectors of air, water and soil. The plan avoids inappropriate zoning in areas of moderate and high flood risk. Flood-related risks remain, however, due to uncertainties with regard to extreme weather events, and these risks will be mitigated by measures that have been integrated into the plan. Under the heading of climate mitigation, the plan includes various measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with European, national and council targets. And these plan measures include those relating to sustainable compact growth and sustainable mobility, building design and energy efficiency. Under the heading of climate adaptation, the plan includes various measures to manage and reduce the impacts of climate change, such as those related to flood risk management and climate resilience. So the second type of environmental assessment that was undertaken on the plan is appropriate assessment, or AA. And appropriate assessment assesses the implications of the plan on European sites. Appropriate assessment is required by the Habitats Directive, a European directive. And appropriate assessment relates to European sites. So there's two types of European sites: special areas of conservation, or SACs, and these are designated under the European Habitats Directive for the protection of habitats and species important on a European or national level. The second type of European site is special protection areas, or SPAs. And these sites are designated under the European Birds Directive for the protection of endangered species of wild birds. There are 38 European sites designated within or partially within County Roscommon. That's 29 special areas of conservation and 9 special protection areas. Areas within the county designated as European sites include the River Shannon Callows and other rivers in the county, Loch Corrib, Loch Ree and other lakes, various firlochs and various bogs. The conclusion of the appropriate assessment process is that mitigation has been included in the plan that will prioritise the avoidance of effects on European sites, and that the plan is not foreseen to give rise to any significant adverse effects on the integrity of European sites. So in addition to being informed by the AA, the SEA has been informed by an SFRA, a Strategic Flood Risk Assessment. SFRA is required by the Flood Risk Management Guidelines, which were adopted in 2009. They're ministerial guidelines. They must be complied with by the Council. Under the guidelines, lands at high and moderate risk of flooding from rivers can generally not be used for development, although water compatible development, for example, is appropriate, and there are exceptions. And we've integrated a constrained land use strategy into the plan to ensure that the plan allows for development in appropriate locations, but also complies with the guidelines. The ministerial guidelines require that the Council and the SFRA considers quite significant flood events when delineating flood zones. Flood zone A must show a predicted 1 in 100 year flood event. That's a flood event that occurs once every 100 years. That's quite significant. Flood zone B shows a predicted 1 in 1,000 year flood event. So these significant flood event return periods mean that an area that has no documented history or local knowledge of flooding does not mean that it is not at risk of flooding from a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 year flood event. So the SFRA is based on the flood zones A and B, and these identify different probabilities of flood risk from rivers. In flood zone A, where the probability of flooding is the highest, the implications for zoning under the plan are most severe. There are implications for zoning under flood zone B, where the overall probability of flooding is moderate. And in flood zone C, various flood risk management provisions contained within the plan also have to be complied with. Where SFRA findings are ignored, ministerial directions have been issued in the past and projects have been refused. So before the final slide, I can take you through the plan preparation and environmental assessment process. The environmental assessment process began when the plan preparation process began, and the first step was to scope the issues to be considered by the assessment in consultation with environmental authorities. Following scoping, the SEA informed the preparation of the pre-draft plan, and environmental considerations were integrated into the pre-draft plan through the SEA, AA and SFRA processes. The Chief Executive's draft plan and the environmental assessment documents were considered by the elected members before public display, and assessment was undertaken on any changes to the Chief Executive's draft plan, and the findings were documented. The plan, the draft plan, and the associated documents are currently on public display. And submissions received on the draft plan and associated environmental assessment documents will be responded to by the Chief Executive, who will submit a report to the members for consideration. And the members will consider the Chief Executive's report recommendations, and they may propose motions, ultimately agreeing on proposed material alterations. Those proposed material alterations and the motions will be subject to SEA, AA and SFRA advice and assessment where relevant. The material alterations will be placed on public display alongside the SEA, AA and SFRA documents, and the members will consider the Chief Executive's report on submissions at that stage and may propose motions for modifications. Those motions must comply with certain legislative restrictions, and more detail will be provided on this process later in the plan preparation process. Ultimately, the plan will be adopted and the documents will be circulated to the Office of the Planning Regulator for review. And at the end of the process, an SEA statement is made public. And the SEA statement details how environmental considerations have been integrated into the plan. So, summary of key points. The draft plan complies with the strict environmental obligations set out by the European directives that have been signed up to by Ireland. All decisions relating to the plan must take account of and comply with these obligations. SEA, AA and SFRA are guides to the best areas for development within the county, and they enable the council to direct development towards robust, well-serviced and well-connected areas in the county. Evidence-based planning and compact development make the plan more legally and environmentally robust. So that concludes the overview on the environmental assessment processes, and I'm now going to hand you back to Martin. Thanks.
Thank you for that informative presentation. It's again very difficult subject to try and explain, especially over a webinar. As David has outlined there, really important that we do address all the environmental issues, and which are predominant throughout the plan, but also put the mitigating measures in place to ensure that we do have sustainable development happening throughout the county. Again, as I say, please don't hesitate to ask us some questions using the icon that's there. Right, what I'd like to do now is before we sign off, I'll pass you on to Pio, who's going to demonstrate live on the screen here how to make a submission in relation to the county development plan. So I'll now hand you over to Pio. Thank you, Pio.
So there are two ways to make a submission. The traditional method of by posting it into the forward planning section in Áras an Conde in Roscommon town. Or you can make an online submission through our dedicated website. As Martin mentioned earlier, all documents associated with the county development plan can be found here at both pre-draft and the draft stage. So to make a submission, you simply click on the submissions tab at the top of the page, like so, and this will bring you towards our consultation hub. Here you will be able to read about consultations, the legislative background of them, and the details in relation to how and when to make it. It is important to remember that submissions must be made by the 2nd of July, and late submissions will not be accepted. So to make a submission online, we would ask that you would fill in your name and address, and we would point out that while all the submissions are to be published on the website in line with the legislation, your contact details will not be published. It will only be your name that will be published. Then we'd ask that you just highlight the topic of your submission, whatever the topic is, whether it be core strategy, people, places, economic development, or whatever. You can pick one or more of any of these topics. If you're unsure, just please click General Submission. If you have a short submission that you want to make, you can type it in here. Now just beware that there are a maximum of 1,000 characters permitted here. However, if you do have a larger document that you have saved on your own device, you can upload it by clicking here. Once your file has been uploaded, you simply press the submit button, and this will submit your submission to us. And as I say, it will be uploaded onto our website within 10 days of being submitted as per the legislation. So thank you, and again, we expect you to, we welcome your submissions in on the plan before the 2nd of July 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Pio. Thanks for showing how to make a submission there. That brings us to the end of this webinar. And before we do finish off, again, to reiterate, we will be putting the questions and our answers on our website, rosdefplan.ie. I do encourage people to make their submissions. I'd like to thank all the people who've attended the webinar today. I'd also like to thank our presenters today for giving us information in a clear, coherent manner in some of the issues which are very technical, so that was very useful. I hope you found it informative and useful. And as I say, it is the citizens of Roscommon's County Development Plan, and we do look forward to receiving submissions from you in relation to it. Thank you.